Hi, this is Carrie Brownstein.
This is DJ Premier.
This is Darren Aronofsky.
You got the RZA right here.
Rose McGowan.
Radiohead.
Aisha Tyler.
Tribe Called Quest.
Fred Armisen.
Fritz Paul.
Javier Munoz. Seth Meyers.
Frankie Cosmos.
Flying Lotus.
Hi, we're Chaim, and you're listening to the Talkhouse Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Talkhouse Podcast. I'm Josh Modell. On this week's episode, we've got two guys who've been friends a long time, but recently formed a new project together. Oh, and one of them happens to be the bassist in a little band called Pearl Jam. It's Jeff Ament and John Wicks. Now, Jeff Ament you've surely heard of since he's a founding member of one of rock's biggest and most reliable acts, Pearl Jam, who've been going strong and steady since the early 1990s. That band released their latest album, Gigaton, right when the pandemic first hit us, so it scuttled some touring plans, but Pearl Jam is back out on the road this fall. Ament has always been a musical seeker beyond his main gig, though, experimenting both with solo records and side projects over the years. He's also an accomplished visual artist, and not only is Ament the hand behind Pearl Jam's iconic stickman logo, he's also an incredible painter and poster artist. You'll hear some of that in this conversation. Now, John Wicks is an accomplished drummer, probably best known as a founding member of the band Fitz and the Tantrums, though he's also loaned his skills to the likes of Bruno Mars and CeeLo Green. He teamed up with his old friend Ament to make the music for a TV series called Under the Banner of Heaven, and then the pandemic allowed them time to start an entirely new project that they've called Def Charlie. Their debut album under the name is Catastrophic Metamorphic, and it's a weird, fun, occasionally dark set of psychedelic pop that's also fully engaging. Ament sings lead on most of the songs, which is new for him. Check out a little bit of We Are Doing It right here. The chat you're about to hear took place the day after Def Charlie's first rehearsal as a full band. Even though Wicks and Ament never really intended to play these songs live, plans changed and they'll be making their live debut at the Ohana Festival in early October. Both of these guys live in Montana now, and they chat about Ament's upbringing in small-town Big Sandy, Wicks' recent job as a professor at the University of Montana, how originality is often discovered through mistakes, and the unparalleled joy of finding yourself inside the music or other art that you're making. Enjoy.
Maybe a good place to start is our first rehearsal last night. I could tell you were getting a good vibe from everybody.
Yeah. They all seem super sweet. That's sort of the first time that I've been the singer in a band, I've done rehearsals where I sing a song.
Yeah.
But like going through 5 or 6 songs and like remembering all the words and listening to everybody, because Jolene was singing with me and trying to get a vibe for all that. It was cool just to have that hat on. It has that feeling of a beginning band, which is always like super exciting. You have, those first rehearsals of every band that you've been in are like kind of the most exciting times. So it definitely had that feeling, which is like really cool.
It totally does. And so as long as Pearl Jam's been going, like, is the extent of the vocal stuff that you've been doing mostly just background, and then there's like the occasional like, let's feature Jeff on this thing?
Yeah, really, there's only one song that ever made a record it was kind of a little bit of a joke song called Sweet Lou. And I get coerced into playing it live, and it's like a really weirdo, like maybe one of the most weirdo Pearl Jam songs. So it's not, usually doesn't go down great live.
Right.
But it's mostly just backgrounds. And there's plenty of, there's been plenty of times I brought in complete songs that have all my vocals on it, but that's a different thing than sitting in and singing through songs with basically strangers.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting last night because we were playing tunes that you were using your falsetto in.
Yeah.
And I think like my only concern with that was that I couldn't remember if it projected like the same way as your full throated voice does. And the answer is yes, it does. Like it was like there was no problem hearing what you were doing. And Jolene's voice, the high harmonies that she was doing, that it actually blended really well. And when the other two guys sing as well, I think it's going to be sick. And Tommy just kills me, man. Tommy is just he's just such a badass. He comes in knowing the songs better than we do.
I think that's the way he plays in this jazz, world. Like you learn how to play every note, on every part, so you can go any way.
Yeah.
So that, it's going to be cool just to get a few more rehearsals under our belt, sort of be nailing the changes and all of that.
Totally.
It's crazy to be at this point considering where we started, because that, I don't think until a couple of months ago there was any intention of ever playing songs live.
Right.
But that's the exciting part about the journey, is that it's sort of letting us know that it's, there is more to do, more to be done, and more challenges and more fun.
I was thinking about this yesterday. I guess, I don't know, I'm getting a little older now, and I'm starting to well, to be honest, I'm trying to eliminate things from my life that I don't give at least 90% of fuck about. You know what I mean? And it's an interesting process because it's hard to detox from being the yes man, where I've always just said yes to everything that came, because I sort of out of necessity, just even from a purely financial level, the hustle has been just nonstop for 30 years. So it's tough for me not to say yes to everything. But lately, I've been trying to not do that. And I guess because of doing that, I have more time to reflect, which is both a blessing and a curse. But the good part of it is that I'm able to recognize what's really important. And this project in particular has been really good for me, just to kind of spread my wings a little bit more, again, creatively. But it's in an environment that I relate to a lot more, in that back in the day, it was never a struggle to stretch creatively when I was just playing jazz music, right? Just because that's what that's about. But to do it within composition and within a more of a rock-based style has been a really cool thing, man. It's not something I ever anticipated, and it's been really an eye-opener for me to see what's possible and what's important. It's been great. And it sucks that it took a pandemic to start that,
The thing I've always found funny is when all these different genres sort of put rules or regulations on sounds, arrangements, any of that stuff. And I think that's what's been fun about this, is that I think we've taken a lot of different angles of these songs and sort of pushed and pulled them into arrangements that we're not used to, and sounds and styles that maybe are new to each of us. And that's the exciting thing. And there's no reason why things that are rock based or that can go into that rock framework can't get more free and wide open. Rock music used to be that way in the 60s, in the early 70s. There was a lot of improv going on. So again, that part's exciting, and just knowing that, when we make some more songs, that we sort of have all these amazing different players that can sort of add unique flavors, to whatever we move forward with. And it all came to a head for me just last night in practice, sort of seeing what, all these folks can do. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is cool. I've been reading a lot about Ornette Coleman, and something that occurred to me, and just researching the drummer Paul Motion, and I'm kind of obsessed with him. And one thing that occurred to me is that it seems to be this recurring trend that happens, that the people that get chastised or sort of, belittled from other artists or the press or whatever it is, seemingly always end up being the ones that 30 years down the road, we go, oh, they were actually a genius, and that's where music was headed. Yeah. And reading about Ornette and just what he had to endure, it's mind blowing. I mean, how many guys wanted to kick his ass? How many people actually did kick his ass physically, for doing what he was doing? And to be honest, I sort of bought into it. For a long time, I didn't get it. I didn't get Paul Motion either. I didn't get what he was trying to do. But there's always that one aha moment, and usually it takes somebody with the flashlight, saying, just listen to this and what he's doing there. And then it sort of opens up my mind to go, oh, and I hate to say this because I feel guilty saying it, because it's oh, that's valid. You know what I mean? I don't even want that to creep into my thought process. So whether something is valid or not, but right. If I'm going to be honest, it takes somebody showing me something that I'm oh, okay, I get that, But it's funny that you were talking about the different styles that we just brought into this Def Charlie thing, is that my constant concern throughout the whole process was is it too diverse? and is it too hodgepodge, I guess, and then I like this thing Ornette says consistently in almost every interview that I read about. He said, I don't have a style, because when you have a style, it dies. Like that's when things stop growing and you become entrenched in that one thing. And I mean, literally, like every interview I've read with him, he says that, or some variation of it. And it's sort of comforting to hear somebody like that, sort of give me and you license to, like, it's okay to not stick to just one thing, and have just that, you be known for just that sound, and I'm sure it's like, you being a painter as well, I'm sure it crosses over into that world.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the great part about any kind of collaboration or being in a band. I mean, it can get tricky in a band because there's 5 or 6 strong personalities. It's a lot. But, when each person is going out and absorbing a bunch of different music and styles and art, and then you bring that back into the room. And even if somebody brings in a complete song or complete arrangement, as soon as the other person or other people, if you let them sort of push the song into the place that they hear it, then that's sort of when it becomes unique. It's like, I think it's when the bands, if there's a singer-songwriter that has too much control over what style it's got to be, and it's got to be like my demo and play exactly the notes in my demo, I think that's when it gets, I guess what Ornette said, that's when it dies, it's, then the people that are playing the song really aren't playing the thing that's in their heart. They're playing the thing that's somebody else's heart.
Right.
And I think I always feel like I can see that live in a performance. I've always thought the most important part about being in a band is letting each other sort of contribute, because that's the only way that the song sort of becomes interesting and unique. And one time that I saw Ornette was when he had the 2 trios, and it was hard to wrap my head around it. That was the first jazz show I'd ever seen. It was Ornette Coleman's 2 trios. Wow. And it was like, and I would just focus on one trio, and then I could kind of wrap my head around that. But hearing it at the same time, it was like, it's so symphonic and so free. And then I remember the guy that took me, he was talking about harmonious arrangements, like where, the stuff is just coming in and out of like connecting. And that's the exciting thing about any of these, that's the exciting thing about playing with you. All of a sudden you're in a room with a whole brand new set of, like, somebody has a whole new set of tools that you've never seen.
Right.
That part of it is super exciting. Again, at this point in my life, it's like, I just want to do new stuff. I want to feel something new. I want to create something new. That's the stuff that gets me excited. You were talking about the hustle and you go through that period of time where you just want to be cool and you just want to write a hit song and you just want to, be popular and people like you. And I just don't give a shit about any of that anymore. Like, I just want to make cool art that, when I listen to it or I play it for somebody, I'm like super proud. Like, we just did something that's like brand new to me. It's probably brand new to you too.
One thing I've wanted to ask you for a while, how much does your audience even come into play when you're writing? Do you even think about them at this point at all?
I mean, I'm sorry, audience, but no.
Yeah.
All my favorite music, it's like when people put 100% into it and they've done it for years, like if they're going all in on it, the chances are I'm going to relate to some aspect of it and I'm going to love some part of it. If it's like, if they're connecting to some spirit or some real thing with their music and their lyrics and the melodies and rhythms, like there's a good chance that as a music lover, you're gonna love some part of it if they're committed to the song. I even feel like sometimes live, like I feel guilty saying it, but I always at the beginning of a show, like I'm just trying to get inside the songs. It's like I'm trying to find that, because I know when I'm not inside the songs and it sucks, like if the sound's not right or whatever. But if you can get inside the song, and then you can get inside the band and what the band's doing, and then I think that energy emanates from you. I think when you play, I think some of my favorite musicians like have their head down and their eyes closed, and that's like I get the most out of some of those people than I do somebody who's David Lee Rothing it, or, really connecting aggressively, connecting to the crowd. And that's a big part of it too. But seeing somebody with their eyes closed, just like inside the music, I want to go there. I want to go where Brian Blade goes when he's playing. And so I'm never thinking about the crowd, even though that energy is insane and is clearly affecting what we're doing. But I think the only way for me to bring something to the table is to like just put myself in the center of the storm of the music and play it as great and as interestingly as I can, and be powerful. I'm never going to be the guy like blowing kisses to the crowd or whatever. So
that's a big part of it, like committing and playing it authoritatively and committing. But I think most of what you're describing is like when you say getting inside the music, you're really listening to what's happening around you. And I think that's the door that gets us into that zone. And everyone talks about the zone, whether it's like in athletics or in music or any art form for that matter. And like basketball players are like, as you've probably felt it, where like the hoop is twice as big as it normally is, and you're able to like just you're in that space where nothing goes wrong. And once you feel it, you just want it to be that way all the time. So you're trying to find it. But then of course, like it's tough to find a trick to get into that space other than listening, like you just described. I think for us, that's the key, is listening. And I think it's probably, a lesson to be learned even in a conversation level, just being able to listen like that. There's this great drummer who I'm sort of obsessed with named Deontony Parks. And he does this cool thing called Techno Self, where I've been trying to emulate what he's doing, which is playing, keys with one hand and drums with the left hand. But he's able to attain that zone. And, anything I've read or seen him do interview wise, he talks about what's called a transient hypofrontality experiment, which is that exact space that we get into when we exert ourselves, like I got into it when I was doing ultra marathons, like you get to a point where your body just gives up, and then you get into this zone where you don't even feel the ground anymore, and it's such a beautiful space. And you can feel that way in music as well when you're in that zone. And I don't know, man, like, again, as I get older, I just feel like that should be the ultimate goal, like to try to get to that place. Like you just described with Brian Blade, he's able to get there, seemingly, especially when he's playing with Wayne Shorter and stuff like that. Like you hear him play, but it's just because he's listening so intently, in the music. And like I said earlier, I don't think it has to be a jazz thing. I mean, that style of music lends itself because it's so conversational and you have to listen and react. But like even with what we're doing, it just, you can get to that place. First of all, last night, like what I noticed is like I'm out of shape and like playing rock music again. Like, but that's a good thing. Like, there's something so physical about playing drums. I think it's one of the reasons that exertion and that repetitiveness is one of the reasons, like, I think drummers are able to get into that space, that zone that we're talking about. Maybe easier than maybe other instruments, perhaps, just because of that aspect, we're exerting ourselves. And that's one of the things I love. I've sort of had to like almost come to terms with the athletic aspect of drumming, because I used to want to separate athletics and art. And now I'm like, well, part of the reason I play drums is I just like to sweat. I sort of had to just sort of acknowledge that. And it's been cool, like taking a break, the pandemic, and then, just spending time just practicing again has kind of gotten me that place. I'm curious what your process is like. Do you have a regiment as far as like, it doesn't even have to be practicing bass per se, but like just general creative practice. I'm curious if you're regimented about it or how you go about it.
Well, probably 80-90% of the time that I'm playing the instrument, I'm playing it to write a song or find a riff or find a new way of like coming up with something.
Right.
And the other 10 to 20% of the time, I'm doing it as a meditation it can be any instrument. I mean, I do it a lot leading up to a tour where I'll find an uncomfortable pattern or scale, like just something weird, but something that makes my fingers do something that it normally doesn't do. And I'll just try to like lock into a repetition and play it for like a half an hour.
Wow.
Just play that thing so that once you get 5 minutes into that thing, you're not even thinking about playing it, but you're finally relaxed enough that you can sustain playing it for a long period of time. And then you go into a meditative state, which is like the most beautiful thing about music. When you can play something, repetitive. I mean, trance music is that way. There's a lot of religious music that sort of is that way. And I think it's almost one of the things that I love the most about playing music. I mean, I tell my friends that don't play instruments, I'm like, get a guitar, learn a C minor, and just strum it, and try to strum it like in time. And I said, just really think about what notes you're hitting, and just think about trying to do it the same every time. And I said, that's meditation. That's like, then all of a sudden you're breathing in time with this strum, and you're like, you're locked into this thing that you're doing, and like, you feel good from it. You literally, your body feels, you come out of it and you go like, oh, okay, like I'm not depressed anymore.
Right.
And I've always loved music that has those repetitious elements to it. And I think because it does put you in that meditative state. And I think I went through a phase where I was trying to learn how to be a shredder, and that was probably 35 years ago, like where I was like really, I was obsessed with like all the shredder bass player guys. And then I realized that with what I do, there was really no place for
that. Yeah.
And then even going to see shows where you see a rock band or something and there's a bass solo, you're just like, oh my God, that's the worst thing of all time.
Yeah.
It doesn't articulate well in like arenas or bigger places because it's low, and it's like so I at that point I was like, okay, I'm gonna learn how to just come up with my own way of trying to play this instrument, based on the different players that I love, and I get obsessed with music, and I'll just like play along with records, which is basically how I learned how to play, because the only lessons I've ever taken were to learn how to blow an upright. So I've never really, I just get obsessed with, like, you hear some player playing a new way and you're like, oh, what's he doing there? I got to figure that out. And so that's, you're a fan of music. And I think that's the best part, when there's a new young musician comes up and all of a sudden is playing their instrument in a totally different way. And you get obsessed with it, and then all of a sudden you have another tool in the tool belt and you don't even know it.
Yeah. So do you have a time every day that this is when I practice every day, or is it kind of loose?
I usually go in the studio in the morning and try to come up with something that I could put down on tape, a lot of days. And then also usually before dinner, I'll usually, and usually I won't be in the studio then. Usually I'll just be playing piano or playing my guitar or something.
Yeah.
But usually it's just sitting down and going like, I'm just going to put my hands in a weird spot, see what happens.
Yeah. One of my composition teachers, that was a trick to get me over my plateaus. He was like, just put your hands, every finger on a key, and then start removing one by one and then see what's there.
It's like spinning the globe and putting your finger on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to Bolivia next year.
Yeah. You and I have spoken about this drummer, Zach Hill.
Yeah.
He plays with Death Grips now, and he was in that band Hella and a few other things. I'm a huge fan of his. And one thing that I read is he'll choose a pattern like you just described, one that he can't quite pull off. And he'll just play that same thing over for an hour straight, Yeah. And I don't think he's working with a metronome or anything like that. I think he probably pushes the tempo, because pretty much everything that he plays is blazing fast. But he'll just find a pattern and just work that for an hour straight without practicing. And he'll go as hard, like as if he's playing in front of a crowd of, 40,000 people, playing with that level of authority. And I hadn't really thought about practicing in that way. I've obviously, drumming is repeating, so I've practiced that, but there was something about him saying that he did it for an hour straight at a really high intensity rate. And it sort of was doubled up by, you remember we've talked about Fish Fisher from Fishbone? Yeah. And I study with Fish every time I go through LA. I try to get a lesson with him. And that's one thing he always reiterates is, and anyone that's in the building where his practice space is will reiterate this, because they can hear him. Like, he practices and makes the walls sweat. That's the way he describes it. Like he goes in full bore, and it makes sense, because I mean, whether it's Fishbone or whoever he's playing with, you want to be able to play with that level of intensity if you're practicing, you're not really like playing, you're doing it casually. It doesn't really translate, and you're not going to have access to that tool when you get on stage, whereas he plays just balls out, from the get-go. And it's an inspiring way to practice. I've been trying to adopt that into my own thing, because I've been finding that no matter how much I practice something, a lot of times it's not accessible in my everyday playing. I'm just tired of hearing myself play the same old shit, Yeah. And the other thing that was interesting that one of my teachers told me was that the only thing that we're going to play that's original is our mistakes. And because everything else, we've heard somebody do, or we're emulating our heroes or whatever it is, except our mistakes. And so a cool way to approach practicing is it's kind of what you were just describing as well, is like you just start playing until you can't pull something off. And then you're looking forward to mistakes, right? And it takes all the pressure off. Like we have so much pressure nowadays, especially in the digital age with the grid and everything else, to be perfect, right? But like if we just allow ourselves to make mistakes, we're going to have a lot more original voices out there, I think, And I try to instill that in all my students at University of Montana. It's like, because I can just see the pressure they put on themselves and that other instructors put on them. When I have them one-on-one and I'm having them play something and they make a mistake, just, man, how they beat themselves up. And I'm like, man, that's okay. It's like, now let's just figure out what that mistake was and let's loop that for a while, and just to take the pressure off of ourselves to be perfect.
And that's a trick that I've learned live too. Like there's a section of a song that, that's more improv-y and people are going off into things. And like, if you hit a weird note that's not in the key on bass, everybody looks.
Right.
and what I figured out years ago was that you just keep going back to that note a few times after that.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
Yeah.
They're like, oh, and you meant to do that.
Yeah, you meant to do that. Yeah. Yeah, totally. It's like the old joke with drummers. It's like, during a drum solo, when do they clap the loudest is when you drop a stick. And you're like, know what I mean? They want to see the human element that people don't want to see perfection. Yeah. I knew a drummer that would like drop sticks on purpose after a while. I was like, dude, it kind of defeats the purpose, man. I'm fascinated just with everyone's creative process. Is it kind of the same with the visual art stuff that you do? You have a regiment about that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, 100%. Like with the painting, it's like, I usually try to do it first thing in the morning when I'm not thinking about anything. And it's usually just grab the first thing and start doing something. And 90% of the time it's horrible. But the 10% of the time that all of a sudden you're just like trying to get your hand to move in a different way, using a different brush, or using, a different stick or whatever, then you come up with a shape that resonates with you. And that's when you get excited, because you're like, oh, I'm going to turn this into something cool because I sort of mistakenly just freed myself up from all of my training.
Yeah.
And did something new. And that's, again, like you were saying, like you get to an age where you're like, man, I just want to do new stuff. I want to have a new feeling, every day if I can, and it's not a feeling that you're trying to impress anybody. You're mostly just trying to impress yourself, or you're trying to prove to yourself that there's more to learn, and there's more places that you can push into. And that really, it's infinite, and you're just like, I'm going to make tons of mistakes, and I'm going to be crappy for a good part of the day, but for 10 minutes, I'm going to be awesome.
Yeah.
And that 10 minutes is going to be like celebratory. It's going to make it so, you deserve to go have a nice meal, or that mentality was how I was brought up. My dad was always like, you got to earn your dinner. You got to go put the time in, and then your dinner tastes better when you put the time in.
Your brother's a visual artist as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Great one. Yeah.
And so it's surprising to me that in a town of, 700 something people, Big Sandy,
700-800. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Like, I don't know. I guess maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Bainbridge Island was kind of similar in that way, where maybe there's something magical about that isolation. I'm just wondering how two predominant artists came out of that family and out of that town of 700 people.
My brother was the first person I heard that had this perspective. He said, the great thing about growing up where we did is that we could kind of do anything and be pretty good at it, or in some cases, because you're the only one doing that particular thing, like being a skateboarder or something, you'd be the best
right
in your town.
Right.
And I think if you have 18 years of like being able to access things that where nobody's telling you that you're shitty,
yeah,
or putting this, like the way it is now, like I don't know how kids do it. It's like you look at your phone and then you immediately see like 100 people that are way better than you, and so you're afraid to be creative, or you're afraid to take chances because you're afraid to fail. And I think especially when you're a kid and you're going through the chemistry stuff, like you're so sensitive, and we're all taught like that we shouldn't fail. And my brother talked about it. He says like you and I were like really, really good football players. We were the best football players on our team. We were like all state because we grew up in a small state, in a small town, in a small state,
right.
And so you could sort of be pretty good at anything that you put your mind to, because again, like if you're playing drums in Big Sandy, you're probably the best drummer, because there's only one, or there's two or three or whatever.
Right.
That was a powerful thing to go to Missoula and then later Seattle with, whereas I think I had a self-assurance about like, well, maybe I can't do it right now, but like, give me a month. I'm going to put the time in, and I'm going to catch up. And I'll be honest, like every band that I've been in, there's been one or two guys in the band that were way better than me. I don't know if that's easy for people when they're younger, but that was the best position I could be in. And I almost always was in a band with a great drummer, and it was like, okay, I got to fucking put my time in, man. Like if I'm going to like earn my scraps at the table, like, I gotta practice, and I gotta get better. I gotta keep up with this, and that's half the reason I can play at all, is because I've just been around like great, either great musicians or great songwriters. And that just being in the room. And I think if you show that you work hard, you will always be accepted into any group, because there's nothing people want more than guys that are going to put the time in and not just be a good player, but also contribute in all the other ways that it takes to being a band. Because being in a band is far more than just being a musician. Being in a band is understanding the business, and understanding all the visual elements that go into being in a band, and relationships, in the business, and relationships on the road. And there's a lot of ways that you can contribute in the band.
Yeah. That's an interesting perspective when you move to Seattle, when you move to a larger town. Even though when you and I were in Seattle, I don't know, it still felt like a small town. It doesn't really feel that way anymore. But yeah, just being able to put, like, I try to instill this in my daughters, is if I ever hear them say, oh, I can't do that, you always follow it with yet, just that word yet, just put yet after it, and it puts you in a different mindset. That's really cool. I think I think it was the same on Bainbridge Island, Bainbridge, it was only a half-hour ferry ride from Seattle, but it was so isolated in so many ways, and it was maybe it was the woods. It was very wooded and mysterious kind of, but there was, as more than anyone, there was such a talent pool that came out of that environment, And then I went to Central Washington University in Ellensburg, and I remember trying to like do all these different degree paths just so that I could still be creative, but maybe make some money. I remember hearing this story about this kid. I may have told you this before, but this kid who grew up in an even smaller town than Big Sandy. He lived in like some cabin somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, and he was going to Central. But this kid lived in such a remote environment, and it's probably impossible these days. But back then in the late 80s, early 90s, it was probably still possible. Like, this kid didn't really have access to anything. Like, he didn't have access to like magazines or anything. He just had his own imagination, And his freshman year of college at Central, he went and started the graphic design department, and essentially got plucked out by the top design firm in Seattle because he had so many original ideas, because he had no concept of what an ad was supposed to look like, you know?
Awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, man, it was so unaffected, you know? And yeah, I just remember being kind of like struck by that and just realizing that isolation can be a good thing, not super detrimental.
Yeah, and the other thing that my brother and I talked about, I mean, I remember this conversation like 15 years ago that we had about all this. And I said, the other thing is, I think he and I both, like, if somebody told us that we couldn't do something or told us that, you know, you're a loser because you're doing that thing, it's that they don't understand, then you, like, I think we both got kind of righteous about it. Like, oh,
yeah.
You know, you're beneath us.
Yeah.
Like, because you've never heard punk rock, or you've never heard of Francis Bacon or what, you know. So we would lean into that, the weirdo part of growing up. Like, we were really searching out to find our individual being.
Yeah.
And the more that people said that we couldn't do it or that we were losers or whatever, the more that we fought for that part of like who we were becoming. And I think that helped us later on. Like, anytime somebody tells you, wait a minute, let me get this right. You work in a restaurant and you pay to tour and you pay to put out records. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, I would tell my relatives, I'd be like, yeah, we put a record out, blah, blah, blah. Oh, you're making a bunch of money? No, we actually paid to put it out. Like, we're like, huh? What? Like,
right.
Yeah, I work in a restaurant. I've worked in a restaurant for 7 years. You know, they're just like, you know.
Yeah.
And then they tell you like, well, our kid graduated with honors, you know, at the university or whatever, and he's making 6 figures. And
yeah.
He's like, well, I'm in a punk rock band and I just toured the East Coast and it was awesome.
I'm curious though, because I feel like I had that thing too. Well, I know I did, and I still do. If you want to get me to do something, tell me I can't do it. Maybe it was our folks that ingrained that in us, maybe unknowingly. I don't remember having that talk with my mom or my dad. I guess I consider them sort of that personality. So maybe that's where I learned it. But it's such an important thing. I remember like where you and I first crossed paths was at Uptown Espresso in Seattle. And working the mornings there, you're like coming through and you're serving all these business people that are going to their 9-to-5s. And you become the master of that short conversation over the counter. And they're always asking me, so what do you do? And I said, well, I play drums. And the reaction was always, well, what do you really want to do? I'm like, no, that's actually what I'm going to do. Even sometimes my own family could be the worst enemy in that, you know, sort of undermining. Like, I remember them just not believing that I was happy. Like, how are you doing? I'm great. You know, it was always my standard, became like a joke with my folks. I always answered, I'm great. I'd be like living in a rehearsal space in downtown Seattle with no showers or whatever. And they're like, how you doing? I'm great. You know, and they're like, just like, wait, how you're in your 20s and you freaking can't make rent. You're living in a rehearsal space. You know, like, how is this? How are you great?
Yeah, I mean, you know, young people ask like, you know, how do you make it or how? And I'm like, well, that means different things to different people. And I always say like, hey man, you're in your 20s, like just go for it. I was like, when I was in my 20s, I didn't have a car, I didn't have insurance. Half the time I didn't have a phone, and it was okay. Like, because I had a great job. I went to the Raison and there was all these freaky people, and I was engaged again with like, you know, all the people that were getting coffee from me. And then afterwards I got on my bike or my skateboard or whatever, and I went to rehearse for 2 or 3 hours with like my buddies and made live music. And like, you know, it was an exciting life. Like, it was, you know, 2 or 3 times a week you go see a band, you know, you save your money and go see a band. And it was like, you know, I didn't know that I was poor and that I was like, you know, all the things that we get caught up with in our 20s, like, you gotta have insurance and you gotta have, it's like, well, like, I broke my wrists and I figured it out, and I got sick and I'd go to the sliding scale clinic and get, you know, penicillin or whatever. I didn't have much of a safety net. I couldn't just go home, you know, and it was all that drove me to like, well, shit, man, if I worked 8 hours a day and rode my bike 45 minutes, like, I'm going to fucking practice hard. I'm going to try to, you know, I'm going to try to get us gigs, and I'm going to, you know, like, you work harder a little bit, I think, when times are the essence, and then there's a little bit of survival kicking in, and that's all good. I wouldn't take my 20s back for anything, man. And it was if I wrote a book about it, people are like, oh my God, that was such a grind. It was such a hard life. But no, it's pretty great, and also just being away from your parents and doing it on your own. And, again, earning your dinner. Like, it's like, nobody helped me with this.
Right.
Like this mac and cheese I'm eating right now, like I've earned that shit.
I've told you this before, and I know we're running low on time here, but a buddy of mine, Ditto Montiel, wrote this book called A Guide to Recognizing Your Saints, right?
Yeah, awesome.
And, as much as I feel a kinship with you on that front, that we definitely kind of did this on our own. When we reflect, like, you can kind of see those people that sort of were your saints and sort of just kind of nudged you in certain directions,
Oh, yeah.
or just told you something, like I was describing earlier, just even guys that showed me how to listen to certain music, that I had sort of dismissed. But there is those folks that, and I don't know, there was something, I feel, like I say, I wouldn't trade my 20s with anyone like yourself, and there was something magical about that time in Seattle that we were coming up. And I remember those people that gave us that sense of optimism, and that's not what Seattle was known for at the time. We were known as like this sort of like pessimistic, sort of sarcastic kind of environment, but I didn't really view it that way. There was a sense of optimism and being unaffected up there that I think is really cool. And it's one of the things that I hope from Missoula, or any town that no one's really looking at, because the reason you and your band, I mean, you all were aware of what was happening musically at the time. Obviously, you had your ear to the ground, but at the same time, that was kind of an outpost at that point, and
big time, yeah.
Like, there was a lot of bands that didn't even tour to Seattle at that point because it was too out of the way. But it was kind of that cool, sort of unaffected thing that created that original movement that came out of there. And like, I think if there's something to be learned from that, and I try to instill this in the folks at UM, is like, it's where everyone's not looking, that you should go check out. Like, that's where the next stuff, the really heavy stuff's going to come from, so stop being a follower and just like look the other direction when someone is doing that.
Yeah. And go for it. Like, don't put restrictions or time constraints on, like, like, by the time I'm 23, I gotta have a hit record or, just ridiculous. Like,
yeah.
And I think, again, like, because we're so hyper connected to our phones, you see, I mean, man, if you're an artist now and you see all these 20-year-olds, like, killing it, like, it's that can be, I think, a tough thing but I think shut your phone off and just do it.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Talkhouse Podcast, and thanks to Jeff Ament and John Wicks for chatting. If you liked what you heard, please follow Talkhouse on your favorite podcasting platform and check out all the goodness at talkhouse.com. This episode was produced by Myron Kaplan, and the Talkhouse theme is composed and performed by The Range. See you next time.